All right, Jimmy, master ceremonies as you are, I'd say we can kick off if you're ready, and we'll keep an eye on the waiting room as people file in. But
yeah, I'll keep letting people in as it goes on. But yeah, I guess we can get started. So hi everyone, and welcome to this session of the Progressive Britain Conference. Our session is What's Happening in Ireland, and you'll see we've got some brilliant guest speakers on this. If you'd like to ask any questions, please use the chat functionality to do that, and Barry will read them out at the end and get through as many as we can get through. We'd recommend you put it in speaker view so you can see who's sort of speaking as we go along. If you'd like to show your appreciation, you can clap in front of the screen or wave your hand, or you can use the reactions that we've got in Zoom. So I'll pass over to Barry, who's going to be chairing this event. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming.
Thanks a million, Jimmy. Stílí of Cllr, Camilla Fótrófig on sesiún Shuf, we Codtar Siúlan Éireann is am Tovachtuk Asian Ayenav. I've always wanted to do that. So I'm delighted to welcome you to the session in Irish. Good afternoon. I am Barry Colfer. I'm a fellow in politics at Cambridge and the Director of Research at Policy Network. I'm delighted to welcome you to this important discussion about what's happening for progressives in Ireland. I must apologise if my connection drops and comes and goes. It's been a bad week for it. It's always an important time for progressives in Britain and throughout the UK to keep an eye on what's happening in Ireland, but arguably now more than ever, or at least now more than for a long time. The implications of the UK's protracted withdrawal from the EU continue to play out, and as diplomatic and political tensions continue to tighten or heighten amid the fallout from the Northern Ireland Protocol in particular, as the debate around Irish unity takes new shape and force, and as there are changing of the guard in the Democratic Unionist Party, amongst many others. As we look forward to Assembly elections in Northern Ireland next year, and as the Irish Labour Party continues its recovery after a very difficult decade. So now more than ever, relations between progressives and these islands are vital. And I'm therefore delighted that we have a truly superb selection of speakers to speak on this subject. Our panelists we're going to first of all hear from Hanna. Cllr is the SDLP, Social Democrat and Labour Party MP for Belfast South, and is a voice for reason in the complex world of Northern Ireland politics. Cllr has also always been a forceful voice to defend and strengthen relations between the SDLP and Irish Labour, so she's always been a hero of ours. Rebecca Moynihan is an Irish Labour Party senator and her party spokesperson on housing, local government and heritage. Housing is quickly becoming the defining political issue of our time as the COVID pandemic inches towards what will hopefully be its conclusion. So Rebecca is really at the forefront of Irish politics and is a rising star in Irish Labour and progressive thinking in the country. And finally, we're going to hear from Deirdre Costigan. So Deirdre is Labour councillor and recently elected deputy leader of Ealing Council. So congratulations, Deirdre. She's also vice chair of the Labour Party Irish Society. We're delighted you can all be with us. The format is as follows. Each of the speakers are going to intervene for between 1 and 5 minutes, when you might tell us about what's happening where you are for progressives and what some of the big challenges or opportunities are. I'll be sure to let you know when your time is running out. I'll then facilitate a discussion between the four of us, hopefully with mainly you guys speaking and me listening, and that will allow time for questions and answers at the end for 15 or 20 minutes. And as Jimmy said, please do put questions into the Q&A. The amount of time I spend on the discussion between the panelists will be driven by the amount of questions that are waiting for us. So without further ado, thank you again very much for being with us, and I invite Hanna, MP, to take the floor. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Barry, and thanks for that that introduction. And it is a great panel. As we were coming online at the start, we were saying we could probably talk all afternoon. So I will try to be brief. I want to just discuss three sort of currents and obviously I'm focusing on Northern Ireland that are in some tension and competition and some confluence, but I think are kind of underwriting what's going on politically. The first is the protocol stroke Brexit, and you know, as we've been warning for about 5 years, Brexit was always going to be destabilizing if it ended up in a win-lose situation, which is why the SDLP with Labour and others tried desperately to soften it, to have no Brexit if at all possible, but certainly to have a borderless Brexit, because we were aware that, as well as the practical ramifications and the interruption of trade, it was going to be really discombobulating, and it was going to create this sense of a binary win-lose outcome. Unfortunately, in particular, the DUP and elements of the Conservative Party ignored those warnings and did kind of crash on towards chasing a very hard Brexit. And we can get into some of the details, but the protocol was the outcome of that. It was nobody's first choice. Certainly, we didn't vote for it. Immediately when it appeared, pushed back and anticipated the problems, both in terms of the logistics and, I suppose, the sense of loss to unionism. It is worth saying that there are differences between a land border and a sea border, and people are trying to erase that, but it's different having your ham sandwich, having gone through some checks and being checked physically as you go about your daily life, getting your car stopped if you're going to work or whatever. But you can understand the sense of injury, and the SDLP certainly has tried to be really understanding of that people feel that there's a diminution of their Britishness, for example. It is also worth saying, though, there are many issues on which Northern Ireland and Britain diverge, usually at the behest of the DUP, on things like libel law and abortion and aspects of welfare, where they're happy for people here to have very different outcomes and opportunities to people in Britain, if they're of their choosing. But anyway, it is in the boring details stage, being ground out between the joint committee. There have been things that we're able to resolve quite quickly. 80% of business consistently, when they're polled, are saying we can make this work. There are challenges, there are definitely issues, and they're having to reorient supply chain and so on, but it isn't the kind of Mad Max scenario that people, like the DUP and David Frost are trying to present, that Northern Ireland's on the brink of societal and logistical collapse. So that is definitely driving things, and we might pick up about the DUP change. Massive Arlene Foster, Theresa May parallels in that regard, in that she had a bad hand, which she played very badly, but it was just destabilized externally by more extreme men in her party who had and have no better ideas and no better outcomes. The second is, and these things are in tension, but a reassertion of the centre ground. And you'll have seen, for example, in the 2019 elections, both of them, like the kind of non-aligned other vote of Alliance and Green went from, I think, about 9% to about 18%. And at the same time, you've seen a bit of a resurgence of, for example, the SDLP, who have for the first time in my sort of nearly 2 decades of the party, kind of got our act together and are, operating in the centre ground, and that has been responded to. You can see potential for the Ulster Unionists are having a leadership a change at the moment as well, and the lead candidate is Doug Beattie, somebody who's very strong in his unionism, but is a normal person and kind of gets interdependence and gets kind of social issues, and I suppose sees that for the union to survive, it needs to stop being so obnoxious. He is one of the people who subscribes to the view is that union isn't the problem, it's unionism. But I think it's really important that people don't confuse that other with not having a view on the constitutional question, because there are those like Alliance who imply that if you are a unionist or you are a nationalist, you are by definition sectarian, and that's not really true. It's just people who don't want to be defined but by that, and I would include myself in that category. I believe in a new Ireland and will work towards it, but I just don't want it to be my primary identifier. So not everybody in that other category is. The third, and I've only got about 10 seconds left, so we'll pick it up, is the constitutional change, New Ireland conversation. That's being driven by three things: Brexit, Boris and babies. And by that I mean that the kind of Brexit has thrown everything up in the air constitutionally. Boris is the push factor as people just recoil from what British politics has become, and babies, I say flippantly, is about some of the demographic realignment that's happening at the same time, and that many of us in centre ground increasingly see that maybe a new paradigm is the only way we're going to get governance, better governance and better outcomes, and so on. But that is definitely a marathon, not a sprint, and I'm sure we'll pick it up in the conversation afterwards. Thank you.
Thanks a million, Claire. Succinct and inspiring as always. Rebecca, go back to follow.
Thanks a million, and thank you very much for having me. So actually, I like how Cllr finished up there because it's kind of going to lead in to what I'm going to say. And I suppose when I was thinking about this during the week, I was thinking about it in terms of taking it from the perspective of, you know, we are all social democrats and people of the labour movement within here. And I really wanted to kind of talk to an internal audience as people born of the labour movement, how we would approach what's happening on our islands. And I think that's an interesting question to begin to consider now. So we see certainly in the Republic of Ireland at the moment, there's a lot more of a talk around moving towards a united Ireland. And to a certain extent, I think what's happening with Brexit has speeded up that process. As Cllr said, Brexit and babies, I'd probably take Boris out of that because I don't think he's going to have as long-term of an impact. But I certainly think the constitutional change that's happening in Britain between what's happening in Northern England and what's happening in Scotland, what's happening in Northern Ireland as well, I think is creating those conditions where we're finally beginning to talk about it. And I think the other thing that has led to kind of the conversation around the shared island is that we've had two transformational referendums in Ireland of things, certainly with repeal, that I certainly never thought I would see happening in my lifetime in terms of people actively voting in favour of abortion rights. And I think because of that, I think there's a younger generation in Ireland that have seen the ability of referendums and the political process to have that transformational change that they can get behind as a movement, as opposed to get behind between different political parties. So we're seeing about 67% of people in the Republic of Ireland being in favour, but then much lower numbers in Northern Ireland. But as Cllr referenced there, I think there's a middle ground that's growing and emerging, that their politics is informed by the constitutional question, but doesn't dominate in terms of the constitutional question. What does that look like for us and our movement? And I think that's really important because I think all of us are undergoing social democratic parties across Europe are in flux at the moment in terms of an identity. We see a kind of a growing green movement that's potentially eating into a base that we have, and we certainly see in Britain the loss of the red wall. Many reasons and issues they are for there, but I think it's challenging from different sides of the labour movement. I'm somebody, I always say when it comes to labour, the hint is in the name. Right, we are a party and a movement that are born out of the labour movement, that are born out of organised labour, that are born out of the idea that by working collectively together, we can achieve more. And when you look at the debates that we're having about how much we are in crisis at the moment, I always try and bring it and strip it back and say our movement was the movement that didn't think that decent wages and good terms and working conditions, you know, were going to impact on the economy and capital, and that's what we fought for. Our movement are the movement that saw the right for every child to have a quality education. It was our movement that you know, brought in ambitious housing programs and state bills of social housing and housing in a way that we just don't see the state doing that. And we need to reimagine that boldness of thinking. And when approaching the issue and the question of a united Ireland, a shared Ireland, is there going to be constitutional change? How do we deal on an east-west basis there? I very much think that we need to be thinking in terms of, when Ireland got independence, we essentially adopted the British parliamentary system, which was set up by landlords and lords in order to be able to govern the small person. And we adopted that wholesale. And that parliamentary system that we have, I'm not so sure is works in place for 21st century. I don't think it works for people in a regional perspective. I don't think it's working for individuals. I think there's a feeling of a gap between parliamentary procedure and representatives. So what would a new Ireland look like? Or what would a new governance procedure look like? And I have always looked at the teething problems of devolution that the new Labour government introduced in '99, but also thought that that was a bold political idea. And we're seeing the consequences of that coming out. So if you were to look at shared Ireland, the political systems and structures, I think, would very much have to change. They would maybe need to be on a more regional basis and structure. What would that look like? How would it feed in? And from our perspective, I certainly think that social democracy and the Labour movement are the parties that are best placed to give people from different regions and different traditions a banner to fall underneath, because our party is international, or sorry, our movement is international in its outlook, it's person-based in its outlook, and we are the ones that are driven by the values of Labour that I think transcend that kind of small-minded, narrow nationalism that we see. And I think that's the real challenge for us in the next couple of years, is that how do we come up with those bold ideas, and how do we advocate that it is our movement, are the people that are best placed to do that. So I'll leave it there. Looking forward to hearing Deirdre, and congratulations on her election as deputy leader, and looking forward to having a chat afterwards.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I'd encourage everyone on the call who hasn't yet or recently taken a trip to Dublin to consider attending at the next general election to go canvassing for Rebecca in the leafy suburbs in Dublin South Centre, where she's going to be our next Labour TD.
Excuse me, I'm inner city, I'm not leafy suburbs.
Okay, look, I guess it's a choice of, it's a question of perspective, I guess, but point taken. Deirdre is, as I said, is a local councillor and is here to speak on behalf of, I guess, the kind of great tradition of the Irish in Labour and the kind of great kind of tradition that is. So Deirdre, if you have, if you might, you're muted, please. Yeah, 0 to 5 minutes.
I'm
Thanks,
unmuted.
Deirdre.
I'm unmuted. Thanks, Barry, and delighted to be here with Cllr and Rebecca, both of whom the Labour Party Irish Society work closely with. When I was first asked to speak at this session, and they said it was what's happening in Ireland, I did immediately say, I'm not the expert, I live here. And I think it's important to say that at the outset. So I'm really glad that we've had Rebecca and Cllr who actually do know what's going on in Ireland. And that I think a key point is listening to people who live in Ireland rather than us living over here thinking we know it all. But I think I can speak about the Irish in Britain and those of us who are Irish or of Irish heritage in the Labour Party and the broader trade union movement. I work for Unison and who identify as progressives. So I'm going to talk just a little bit briefly about the Labour Party Irish Society role in the party and what we see as the key issues for progressives in this country in relation to Ireland. So we see ourselves as a critical friend of the Labour Party. We're a socialist society and we lobby on behalf of the Irish in Britain with the party. We're also there, though, to foster relations between the British Labour Party and our sister parties on the island of Ireland. But we're very closely connected also with the community. We work closely with Irish in Britain. During COVID, for example, we got our members involved in helping out in local Irish centres. And we've done a lot of work over the last while with the family of Margaret Keane, who some of you will remember was denied the right to have an Irish epitaph on her headstone. So we worked with her family and with MPs in Coventry, Labour Party MPs. So we're not a think tank, we're rooted in the community, and that's really important for us, and I think is really important for progressives to kind of bear that in mind when we're, I guess, rebuilding the Labour Party for the next election. But back to what's going on in Ireland. For us, the key issues have been and continue to be Brexit and defending the Good Friday Agreement. We continually raise the threat of Brexit internally with the party over the last few years, highlighting the danger to the Good Friday Agreement. We did this in internal briefings and discussions, in articles and speeches. I know Fiona O'Farrell is here. She was at conference and led the way on getting a composite that we could back on this subject. But we also found ourselves hitting the streets. We even had to invest in placards. We went on so many marches to try and defend the Good Friday Agreement. So we consistently highlighted the link between EU membership and peace. And that message did get through to the party, although of course now we are where we are. And that threat to the Good Friday Agreement is still there, with the Northern Ireland Protocol now under attack, as we've heard. One of the challenges, I think, in this country has been a lack of understanding within the Labour movement. There was so much confusion about the original backstop, some of it created on purpose, of course, and now there's equally confusion about the protocol. And many within the party, many of our members just don't understand the issues, and I think this is a challenge for progressives. And that's why educating members and elected representatives on the history of the Good Friday Agreement is so important for us. So we've been delighted to be part of the Good Friday education programme that Louise Haigh, Shadow Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, has been leading on. And you can download this on the party's website. I would recommend you go and have a look. It's a 4-part kind of webinar, really, really excellent on the history of the Good Friday Agreement. So many of you will know that as part of the Good Friday Agreement, there was provision for a future border poll, and we've already started to talk about this. You know, it's no longer the elephant in the room. You know, we're talking about it. But for the first time, this issue was raised at the Labour Party Irish Society AGM this year. We hadn't had it before, and there was a call for a referendum and for the party to back reunification. And you might be interested to know that the motion was defeated, and by a significant majority. And, you know, I say that as someone who was brought up to believe in a 32 county republic. So, you know, it's kind of a move to come to a position where you're voting against a border poll and against backing that. But we voted against it because the progressive Irish diaspora, whether we've been abroad for 40 years or were born to Irish families in Ealing or in Birmingham, we understand the complexity of the constitutional settlement between these islands. And we understand the primacy of the principles of self-determination and consent for the people of Northern Ireland. So as progressives, we don't think the Labour Party should back a border poll at this time unless it's something that people in Ireland want. We don't think it should be the decision of people in this country. It should be what people in Ireland want, both sides. Instead, the party should be back in education, such as through the Good Friday Agreement training programme, and continued work to bring communities together based on shared values of equality and respect for human rights. It'll be for political parties, trade unions and civil society on the island of Ireland to outline what an inclusive United Ireland might look like, and to work to build consensus and to attract unionists in particular to that vision. That won't be an easy job, but the job of the British Labour Party, as ever, is not to come down on one side or the other, but to foster common values and to ensure that right to self-determination is protected and maintained. And that position helps to explain another policy position of Labour Irish, which is that we don't support standing candidates in the North. And it's actually written into our constitution. We've contributed to the NEC's periodic reviews on this policy, and we've 3 main reasons for our stance. Most importantly, we think the Labour Party should maintain its role as an honest broker. If we stand candidates, we would need to have a position on contentious issues such as the Irish Language Act, flags and emblems, for example. And once you take a position on these issues, you've come down on one side or the other, and then you can no longer be that honest broker. Added to that, the SDLP, the Social Democratic and Labour Party, as Cllr has said, is our sister party. Solidarity and international socialism have always been our watchwords, and we don't run against our sister parties. And of course, there's always a question, why would we assume the British Labour Party would be the ones running? Maybe the Irish Labour Party would run candidates. It could get mighty confusing if there were 3 Labour candidates on the ballot. So Labour Irish has clear and progressive policy on these issues, which we make sure the party is aware of. But I think finally, we also have a broader remit within the party, and I'll touch on that just to finish. As progressives, we believe in a Labour Party that can win elections and change people's lives, whether they're Irish or not. We don't see ourselves as being limited to only having a voice on what is directly related to Ireland. We live here, some of us for generations, and we have a stake in this country and in this party. So we've been a strong voice for taking the party in a progressive direction. We haven't been afraid to do this. We're Irish, and we've seen what rigid ideology and entrenched positions can do to a country and to a people. The legacy of the Troubles and the Good Friday Agreement has taught us the importance of compromise and common values. So we back a Labour Party that's open, progressive and focused on changing people's lives for the better, and that's rooted in our communities. And I really hope and expect that today's discussions will advance that vision further. Thanks, Barry.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. I'm delighted to see there's lots of activity in the questions and answers box on this like really fascinating and kind of complicated relationship in some respects between the different parties on these islands that I'm going to get to. So rest assured, it's just a shame we have such a short amount of time for this discussion. I hope we can have a part 2 in due course. I just want to put one quick question to each of the 3 of you, and then I'll hand it over to, first of all, if you want to have any questions for each other or any comments, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. Cllr, it's very tempting just to talk about Brexit, babies and Boris, but I want to ask 2 quick questions. Number 1, can you just comment a little bit more on what different alliances might exist, just thinking about what matters for people in Northern Ireland today between the Green movement or various different social movements that you mentioned from across the communities. Can you just speak about alliances that might exist there for progressive change? And secondly, if you can afford a sentence or two on how the SDLP might react to the recent election of Poots to the leadership of the DUP. You mentioned it, but if you could share one or two of your thoughts, or by all means, sidestep it if you wish. And then I'm going to put all the questions out. Sorry, sorry to speak over you. Rebecca, the Labour Party has been behind some of these major kind of these social changes in Ireland that you mentioned with respect to abortion and with respect to marriage equality. Can you just say what is left for Irish Labour to achieve? And most importantly, how can we kind of, much like what's happening with UK Labour, how can we establish our identity on this kind of cluttered space now of the centre left, and however we want to place Sinn Féin on that spectrum? How does Irish Labour Party gain its identity? And then finally to Deirdre, I really enjoyed your intervention, Deirdre. And can you just comment on how the UK Labour could be an honest broker, but from opposition? When it's no longer the 90s, unfortunately, in some respects. But I mean, the 90s were great, the music was better, but also Labour were in power. So can you just say a little bit about how we can best achieve that honest broker role from opposition? Thanks. Cllr, Rebecca, then Deirdre, please. Thanks, guys.
Yep. Brilliant questions. Of course, now my instinct is to try and answer all of them, but I'll stick to the ones that were directed at me. In terms of that, progressive alliance, I am a beneficiary of that. In that the Greens nominated me and campaigned for me in the election, and formally, the Green Party MLA and leader was my key proposer on the election form and so on, and that was a way to get around the clunkiness of the first past the post system, and the fact that in many seats, because of the kind of split, we had ended up with MPs who had voted for a very hard Brexit. I appreciate that isn't something, we're all political people and we differ on bits and pieces, but I think the time, I mean, if you look at the politics of the island of Britain as well, the time for everybody to plough their own furrow and protect their own graph for the next leaflet is passing, unfortunately, because it's leading to dominance. The system is throwing up really inappropriate results. So I think you do that by appealing and by being true to your own values, but by having a platform that progressives can support. And I know, as I said, in my election, I had people from say the SDLP, I had Greens, I had an Ulster Unionist canvass with me, I had an Alliance member, I had the Sinn Féin member, and I had all of the parties in the South, as well as very strong support from the Labour Party in Britain and Labour Irish. And by having a kind of a non-sectarian centre ground but progressive vision, and I'm in Parliament working obviously with Labour, but with the Greens and with Karen Lucas and others on issues that are of interest and in the interests of all of my constituents. In the in Northern Ireland, in the Assembly, i.e. in council elections and MLAs, obviously PRS-TV gives some opportunity to do that, and that happens. And I've been around for a long time, and through different iterations of Platform for Change, which is trying to get the centre ground parties to transfer between each other, which a lot of us do. I've been, and I don't want to mention the war, I've been 15 years ago was attending Labour Forum meetings, which were between British Labour, Irish Labour and the SDLP. I'm kind of a free marketeer in politics, if not in other things. If there are people who think they've got all the answers and how to solve the problem, put yourself before the electorate. I've run in elections where there have been different iterations of independent Labour, but that's people haven't necessarily rallied to that flag. It's more complicated than you think to navigate all of these issues. But I think it is just by being straight with people about where you stand and being clear that it's not sectarian to be a unionist, it's not sectarian to be a nationalist. The Good Friday Agreement has given us the rational mechanism to deal with those things, but it's about cooperation. And as I say, there's a climate change bill going through the Assembly with the Green Party and the SDLP driving it, for example, one of many, many examples. On the Poots thing, look, there's a couple of ways of looking at this. and other people, Poots is more pragmatic than he comes across. He, you know, is pitched as never, 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 and he kind of is. But I know over the years, I've had a few interactions with him. He is, they say, somebody who will do a deal, and there's a hope, and there's validity in this, that he might be like a Martin McGuinness and Sinn Féin figure, because he was at, you know, the extremes and there from day one with the party. He's got more space to turn and compromise, whereas anytime Arlene Foster looked like she might do something moderate or sensible, she was, you know, gobbled up from his wing of the party. But I mean, he has extremely regressive views, and he's not afraid to throw them out on things. I mean, it was really his moves on abortion, for example. He didn't just try to tighten the law. He called in, he asked doctors to produce any abortions that had taken place, to submit the files for review. You know, he really created an impression that the prosecutions were going to follow and stuff. So he doesn't just have very extreme views. He like, for example, perpetuating the gay blood ban. But it's possible, I mean, on things that have been divisive, like the Irish language, for example, he was prepared to make a deal last year, which is somewhat encouraging. And I've noticed, even just in interviews, as people have done this weekend, you know, maybe they're resiling from the bin the protocol to the moderate protocol thing. But look, you know, unionism, DUP in particular, political unionism, haven't shown a tremendous amount of critical thought and strategic ability over the last 3 or 4 years. So we don't know, they could just, you know, chase division and collapse, but I don't see them wanting to collapse the assembly, because it's the only place they have influence. So we travel in hope, but with an eye on experience as well.
I think if Northern Ireland politics needed a slogan, I think it's complicated, but it's worth it. It's probably a good one. So thanks a million, Claire.
Thanks, Barry. I'm going to bounce in here on the question about where next for Irish Labour and what for us to achieve. And so I do think that the Irish Labour Party has, you know, a sound history, particularly the two recent constitutional referendums around the issue of abortion and marriage equality. But we were a participant in that as well, as being a driver around that. I think when I look back at the things that I'm most proud of, it's things like in 1992, developing the Breaking the Star programme, which became like specifically targeted at educational disadvantage. When I look at the things that I'm particularly proud of the British Labour Party, it was how they essentially transformed Britain between 1997 and 2002. So the question going into a general election in 1997 was whether or not the Labour Party could be trusted to raise taxes. And the question in 2002 at that stage was investment in public services. And that was a significant shift by the British Labour Party in actually changing how people thought about how they interacted with the state. So what else is for us to do? I think there's a huge amount. I think there is a generational, I think we saw this in Britain, I think we're seeing it in Northern Ireland. And what I call it, it's almost a raw cry of a generation that have been financially impacted by the financial referendum, or sorry, the financial crisis, and now the pandemic. And it was actually my partner who produced the work during the week that showed that in real terms, in terms of Ireland, how it had impacted on that generation. And I think that there's safe, secure wages, access to housing, access to education, access to apprenticeships. And when I said earlier on that, you know, the name gives away the hint, right? Our name is Labour. We are born from the Labour movement. We are born from cooperation. We are born from solidarity, and we were born from internationalism. And I think that is that is essentially what we still have to achieve, not just on our island, but on other islands, because we are an internationalist movement. I think when we talk about progressives, though, I think we need to clarify what progressive means. Does it mean that you buy into the state? Yes, absolutely it does. But what are the politics behind that as well? And I think that is something that I'm certainly, you know, challenged by. And as I've gotten a little bit older, I think I've actually got more politically sectarian, not in terms of in terms of parties' policies and where they sit in terms of the left. or not. And so we are undergoing, we had a general election in 2020, which I think we saw that massive generational change making their voice heard. And they very much rejected, I suppose, the two old centre-right parties of Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. And the Labour Party were included in that in terms of the rejection of those policies, because we were seen as being a liberal appendage to them. And that is challenging in terms of the Irish Labour Party's identity where we go forward. We have a challenge, a huge challenge in working class communities from Sinn Féin, who the national question, being able to wrap around the national question, and how that identity can really bring people along, but also in terms of things like social issues and health. And we have a big challenge there. We have another challenge in terms of, the Social Democrats, and then also people on the progressive left with the Greens. And I think that is something for us about where we are going to sit in there. I'm firmly of the belief that we have to be of the centre left, of the progressive centre left. But I don't think that any longer, in terms of how politics is changing, and there's a generational shift in voting patterns, does that mean that we will essentially be slightly less conservative than Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, and will, be the party that says that we will protect the more vulnerable to Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael? I actually think that we have to be more radical. There's a poll today, we came out on 4%. It reminds me of what the PD say: you will be radical or redundant, and we need to be radical or redundant, because if we keep on using the language of all of us being in the same in the centre left, the Irish Labour Party is going to be swallowed up by that, and we are swallowed up by the centre right. So I think that is a real challenge for us, and particularly, like, I am very happy dealing with the SDLP when it comes to people like, I know Cllr for like 20 years, so like Cllr and Donal, and people who I very much see as Labour minded, but the leader of the SDLP canvassed directly against me in the last election, and that is a very difficult thing for us to be able to negotiate in terms of our relationship, because that's, that is a difficult position and question that we've been put into that, and I think that's a conversation we need to have around the wider social democratic and Labour movement.
Thanks a million, Rebecca. I'll just pass on straight on to Deirdre in the interest of time.
Right, thanks, Barry. And I think the question was really about it led from the standing candidates thing, didn't it? And it was, how can we be an honest broker, considering we're not in power? And I suppose, to start the answering that, we want to be in power again. That's the whole point that we're here today, isn't it? We want to build a Labour Party that can be in power again. And if, say, there's an election in, could be 2 years' time, and we walk into 10 Downing Street, and we've spent the last 2 years, running candidates in elections in the north, then we lose that honest broker status. And it's all about trust. It's absolutely about trust. Building trust with different communities. And if we have, spent time on one side or the other, we can't wipe that clean in 2 or 3 years' time and go, oh, now we're in government, we'll forget all that, and we are going to be fair and we're going to be above board. That won't happen, and we'll have broken down that trust. People will see us on one side or the other. So we've got to bear that in mind, that we aspire to be in that position of being, being in government in a few years' time, and we have to prepare for that. And we can't do anything to damage our position when that happens, as I believe it will. But I think even in the interim, where we're not in that position, in any case, it's our values. We believe in human rights. I think, as I said earlier, it was hard for me to vote against a border poll. And I think, like lots of people, I've gone on a gigantic journey. My granddad, it says on his gravestone, old IRA. He fought in the War of Independence, and we were brought up with all of that and all the mythology around it. But we've travelled, and the diaspora in Britain, we have travelled so far, where we realise it has got to be about human rights. And that's the perspective the Labour Party has to come from. And if we come down on one side or the other, that makes us look like we are trampling over another community's human rights, that is not progressive. That's not progressive politics. And I think we've all got to travel that journey, and it's not easy. It isn't easy from the different communities to make those decisions and actually go beyond our history. We've been locked in this history, haven't we? But I think there's also a role, even in, whilst we're not in power, for building understanding between communities, for having events like this where we bring people together to talk about the issues. I know before, one of the reasons the Good Friday Agreement kind of, happened was that trust had been built up between politicians over the years. In fact, during kind of side meetings in the European Union and the work that was done through the European Union. We don't have that now, but we have events like this, and we have, the trade union movement, for example. So building those alliances through the trade union movement and through civil society between our islands, that's what we have to work on, I think, as that honest broker position. And like I say, with values of human rights and consent at the core of what the Labour Party stands for. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Deirdre. It really is. It's such a pleasure and inspiration to hear you all speaking. We have to move ahead at a clip because we have about less than 10 minutes left, and I've tried to group the questions in the chat box under 3 headings. So it's ambitious, but we'll try and get through them. The first is on representation in Northern Ireland, and I want to ask this question from the chat because I'd like Cllr especially to have an opportunity to respond to it. It's a very reasonable question. I've lived in the UK for 10 years and people have asked this many a time. Brahma Mohanty had said specifically, why doesn't the party field candidates in Northern Ireland? This is what Deirdre was speaking about in her last intervention to an extent. Chris Wilson, Fiona O'Farrell and Liam's iPhone also kind of contributed to this discussion. Cllr, could you respond to that? Why is it that the SDLP stands in Northern Ireland whilst the Labour Party doesn't?
I think Deirdre has articulated kind of all the views in the round that we do, as members of PES, and that branding is always on every piece of literature I put out over about 10 elections that we take the franchise within our jurisdiction, and the SDLP and certainly, as I say, I got 57% of the vote in South Belfast in the last election. It isn't 57% nationalist. People may not know these neighbourhoods, but places like Tuckmona, Beaver, Sandy Row, Killinure, like I was getting 20% of the vote there. So it was a pitch that people who maybe don't share my views on a New Ireland. But the point is, because of the development of the SDLP, there is a mechanism, and we say my running mate in the 2014 council election was a unionist, a person who said, I don't believe in a New Ireland. We are for people of the centre left, and I appreciate if you look north to the SNP and parties where if there are regions where the constitutional question is dominant, it makes for kind of weird broad church parties, and the Republic is dealing with that as well. That's why there isn't a straight up left right split, because the constitutional question is live. But the SDLP is not a cold house for people who have different views, and we are also entitled to believe that there's logic to a new Ireland, a social democratic Ireland, and for a different arrangement of public services on this island. But we have created a mechanism, and we can say to people, see if you don't believe that, but if you believe what I believe on health, on education, on the climate, on local issues, then vote for me. And when it comes to a border poll, go into a different into a different box. As I say, there are some within, and I've attended tons of Northern Ireland Labour meetings and different engagements over the years. There are some who want it to be a unionist party and are annoyed that it's a nationalist party, and there are some who want it to be a party with no constitutional view. Like I say, I think Labour Party's policy is correct, but I know there's a lot of attempt to kind of, make the SDLP the bad guy here. If you think you have all the answers, and if you think you have a pitch that will resonate with the people of Northern Ireland and all their diversity, go for it. For example, NI21 were essentially, a kind of a Cameroon Tory type project, but they said we'll do it ourselves. We will, and as somebody else all said in the chat box, it hasn't always borne fruit because it is complex. But I know many people, many centre left unionists vote for me and indeed campaign with me when it comes to elections, and I know that's the case for many others. So that is the home that we provide. But in the same way as we're entitled to have a view on Brexit as a constitutional issue, we're entitled to have a long-term aspiration, but we will deliver it in a rational way.
Thanks, Cllr. There's a question I want to put about unity and one about the future of these islands under Brexit. But just before that, I'm going to cite these as what people are interested in. We couldn't possibly discuss them in the time allowed, but do Rebecca or Deirdre want to comment any further on what Cllr just said, or should we clip on?
So we have this in our party from time to time as well about running candidates in the north, and I think the point that Cllr makes is very clear. There hasn't been a great success rate, because where the constitutional question dominates, the constitutional question becomes it. And like I think it would be very difficult for the British Labour Party to go and organise in the north, not knowing the background, the areas, the people, etc. It is slightly different. I would just put I suppose, and this is a challenge for all three parties. I think to a certain extent, the British Labour Party ended up getting written out of the conversation in Scotland, and where the constitutional question comes up. And that's what I'm talking about from an Irish Labour Party perspective. We don't have, on 4% and on 6 seats, we don't have the luxury of staying out of the conversation that a generation are moving towards. We just simply don't have the luxury of doing that anymore. And it was the same for the British Labour Party in Scotland, where it kind of seemed to be that if you were pro-independence, if you were progressive centre-left, you know, you wanted to take back control. And that's why I posed the challenge earlier on in my very first intervention. We actually have to look and ask what a new country is going to be like and what those systems are going to be like. And I actually think things like regional devolved government and local government reform are going to be central to those things, because the one thing that has been a very common theme, I think, on these islands and on mainland Europe as well, is that people wanting a sense of a control over their own destiny in response to globalization, where they don't necessarily feel that they've lost that control. And I think that's an overarching theme of politics in general. And we might boil it down to the constitutional question, but I actually think it's people wanting to have a say over what happens in their daily life and not feeling powerless about it. And I think that's the challenge for us.
Thanks, Rebecca. I see Jimmy has just put his camera on, probably to remind me that we're up against the clock. So I'm going to make the following proposal. I'm going to put out maybe 3 of the questions that I've summarised from the chat box, and I'm going to invite each of you then in reverse order, Deirdre, Rebecca and Cllr, just to comment on any of them or anything else for about a minute each. And then I'm also going to propose that we try and reconvene at some point with the same panel, because trying to have this discussion in 50 minutes is impossible. And you can see from the kind of fervour in the chat box and things, there's real demand for these sorts of discussions. So I'll just leave that there for a further day. From Colin Murphy says, a difficult question. How could social democrats on these islands reach out to working class voters from Northern Ireland unionist communities? That was kind of aired by each of you, but just to kind of give a sense of what people are asking about. Jamie Sloss points towards a big barrier to unification is healthcare, with a nationalist population in the north vote to unify if this means losing the benefits of the NHS. Don't even try and respond to that, but just to kind of draw attention to it, that it is one of the really live issues of the kind of unity question. Because remember, the unity question is only really taking shape in the Republic now as well. Up until recent weeks, it was very much in the abstract, and now people are pointing towards these very legitimate concerns. I'll just quote what Dr. Francis Rehill has said. Should we also develop an education webinar about Irish history and politics for Eton students and future prime ministers? Good point, Dr. Francis. I think this is something that we should, as progressives, seek to improve people's general understanding of Irish history and politics. Then finally, I just want to make a point, and then I realise this is really multifaceted, but I'll pass it back to you guys to have the summating point. I would love to have discussed the European question with this panel. How do we build that after Brexit? Obviously, the UK has withdrawn from the EU. Irish Labour is at a very low ebb and has lost what was until recently a very good representation of the European Parliament. With our kind of dense relations in PES and with our sister parties, how can we try and maximise those links to make things better for people? That was a little bit of a kind of soapbox for myself as well, so you'll forgive me. But I'll go back to Deirdre, Rebecca and Cllr in that order if you want to have any final remarks. And thank you again for your time, guys.
Yeah, thanks, Barry. I'll try and very quickly just say a couple of words about each of those, but very quickly. I think that one of them was reaching out, Social Democrats reaching out, particularly to working class unionist communities. And I think, you know, I mentioned earlier, you know, trade unions have got to be key to that. And we as, you know, the Labour Party, Social Democrats, Progressives, you know, it is that link with the trade unions that gives us that advantage there, I think. And this is, you know, I am a member of the Irish Labour Party and come from, you know, not too far from Rebecca, in fact, Green Hills, Walkinstown, Rebecca. And, you know, the feeling like I sometimes had about the Irish Labour Party is we were lacking a bit that kind of working class trade union link. And as as Rebecca said, Sinn Féin sort of ran in and kind of nicked a bit of that over the last number of years. But actually, that's what the British Labour Party has a huge link with trade unions, and some of those trade unions operate in the north. So I think that we have like a really great opportunity there to work more closely with some of the trade unions. And my own trade union, Unison, operates in the north and are really kind of, very strong voices there. So I think that's a piece of work that we need to kind of focus on maybe a bit more in terms of making working with the unionist community in the north. The healthcare thing, Barry, you said don't mention, but I have to touch on it, especially as I say, working for Unison, because we are a healthcare union. That's one of our main areas. So my partner, we've often discussed, should we go home? Well, should I go home and she'll come with me? And one of the reasons she always says she won't go home is because of the lack of an NHS. She's like, I could never go and live in Ireland with you because there's no NHS, and I'd have to pay 50, 60 euros if I had to go to the doctors or the hospital. So, I think, when people who are not the British Labour Party, because it is not our role, but when people in perhaps the Irish Labour Party and the SDLP, etc., are talking about this idea of a new Ireland, then that is, I think it is going to be absolutely key, because the NHS is so totemic, I think. But like I say, that's not a decision for the British Labour Party. That is for people who live in Ireland and not for us. And I think the final thing is just on that last point about education. Yes, the Good Friday Agreement education programme that we worked with Louise Haig on has been hugely successful. I mean, I think the first one had the highest attendance of any Labour Party training session they've ever had. So there is a real appetite for it. And I think we need to do more of that, so that we in the British Labour Party understand the history of Ireland, and that there's not easy answers, as in an easy answer is running candidates in the north. That's what it doesn't solve anything. There's no easy answers. There are complicated, difficult potential solutions, but we're going to have to work really hard to get there. It won't be easy, but thank you.
So I'm actually going to quote two people now. One is John Hume, and he can't eat a flag. And then the other one is the founder of the Irish Labour Party, James Connolly. And it says, Ireland is distinct from her people is nothing to me. And the man who's bubbling over with love and enthusiasm for Ireland, and yet can pass unmoved through our streets and witness all the wrong and the suffering, shame and degradation wrought upon the Irish people of Ireland, wrought by Irishmen upon Irishmen and women, without burning to end, it is, in my opinion, a fraud and a liar in his heart, no matter how he loves that combination of chemical elements that he is pleased to call Ireland. As somebody who joined the Labour Party and the Labour movement, I didn't join Sinn Féin, I didn't join Fianna Fáil, I didn't join Fine Gael. I joined the Labour Party and have much in common with parties like the Social Democrats, because I care as much about, and I was on a previous call with Stella Creasy, and she was talking about the young trans kid in Walthamstow, or the young fella in Hartlepool that are economically disadvantaged and need our help. And then when you come to the north and you see the young kids that remind me very much about the kids that in my area in the inner city that are bored and frustrated by this pandemic, that are economically affected by it, and they're going out and causing absolute havoc. That is my politics. That is what I care about. And when approaching a united Ireland and the constitutional question, I have more in common with the British Labour Party than I have with the centre-right parties within my own country. I have more in common with people like Cllr in the north of Ireland than I do have with others. Our movement is the movement that can pull together those parts. And it's not about, what jurisdiction you live in. It is about what that country looks like. And that comes to the NHS question. If we are talking about a united Ireland, you don't necessarily want to create an NHS, but you want to create a free at the point of contact healthcare system. You want to create a free at the point of contact equal education system. You want to create a country where everybody has a decent house, that they're not paying hand over foot in terms of rent towards, or high mortgages, or insane house prices. They are the things that I want to see and create in the country that I want to live in, and I will work with anybody who will do and create that. And so for me, it's not about what colour passport I have. And I understand how powerful that can be for some people. But I think that the Labour movement has a particularly interesting perspective in where it's coming from to talk about what that country, what it's like to live in that country as a citizen, and how equal that country is.
Yeah, I agree with every bit of that. And it is genuinely a new Ireland. It's not a reunified Ireland where we just kind of clump us on. And that is why Rebecca said it's the voice of the Labour Party and of Social Democrats on designing what that is, because there is so much focus at the moment on let's have a border poll and how do we have it and what date do we have it, and not on the why are we doing this, what are we going to achieve, how do we improve all of the outcomes for all of the people north and south. And that's why we're saying the work isn't done yet for those, and are saying let's have it tomorrow. I'm not going to knock somebody's door and tell them to vote. I mean, we're not going to have, you don't have all of the answers when you're doing a big change project like that, but I'm not going to knock somebody's door and say, yeah, well, I know you're just going to have to take that on the chin. I know you can't afford life at the moment, but we're also going to have to factor this in. So we have to work these things through. The SDLP launched just in the last 2 weeks the New Ireland Commission, which is a really meaty project that as a kind of the first panel, a panel of experts on different fields, kind of early years and economy, but we have 4 people on health because it is so key to everything that we're going to be doing. And the other, I just picked from the question, how do you challenge Sinn Féin dominance? By being better, I think, in some of it, and for us by decommissioning the sectarian tools that have put and I mean that as in mechanisms, I'm not calling people sectarian tools, although, but who have put those two parties in the position that they are, by allowing them to make every election, oh, well, do you want a border poll or you don't, or who's going to be first minister or whatever. And that is really, really hard. Sometimes from afar can be like, why aren't the SDLP doing better at that? It's really, really difficult when people are skilled at putting constitutional identity issues to the fore. But for us to say, yeah, we know that you want to stay in the union, or we know that you want a border poll, but what are you going to do about people in the here and now who can't live on basically never promises? And then the other, how do we engage with unionists and with non-nationalists? And that is a fundamental part of it. But I think it's about being straight with people. There's no point in me saying, telling people what they want to hear. I'd say I'm clear in my views about the long-term aspiration. And I think people are okay with that. There are people, for whom if the union is the big thing and they want to fly flags, they're probably not going to vote for the SDLP, but very many people are persuadable, and they see that on things like, say, education, the fact that both of the unionist parties support academic selection at 11, which is having terrible outcomes for working class Protestants and unions. When they look at things like Brexit and say this is bad for us economically, they're saying that what we're pitching has far more opportunity for them. But I suppose it is just about a genuinely progressive Ireland that can unite Catholic, Protestants, and centre, but it's also about it being a really straight path on legacy. That would be a whole other seminar, and it's really, really toxic conversation to have, and we're about to have it actually because of what's coming through Westminster. And lots of people, myself included, go, I do not want to talk about this, but we have to actually get into the gory parts of what happened here over many years, because otherwise you are having both kind of hardline unionism and Sinn Féin are rewriting. They're saying we were the goodies, they were the baddies. That's all you need to know. And an amnesty kind of allows them to do that, which is why we have to go through the painful part of dealing with the past so that people can't do very broad brush things. And that is what's going to divide us further and make people feel that whatever the new Ireland, the new Northern Ireland is, it's kind of built on a kind of a fairly sectarian conception of things. But yeah, Barry, great chairing, and look forward to the second leg.
Thank you. Absolutely. I can't wait. Let me just say we're running over as I expected we would, and there are great panels to get to, so I don't want to keep you from it. But Deirdre, a quick remark on the NHS. Wasn't to downplay its importance. You did an amazing job speaking to it so clearly and concisely. It will be the defining part of the union debate in the Republic, I believe. Rebecca, thank you for evoking the ghost of John Hume, one of the great figures of the European Labour movement, not just the Irish Labour movement. And I want to thank you all. The Irish Labour Party, SDLP, UK Labour has fought for every vote it's ever gotten, and it will continue to do so. And I feel extremely optimistic when we have representatives such as the three you've had on the panel here for a bright future and a progressive future. So thank you very, very much. This sort of dialogue is vital. And thank you all for your time. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. And we'll organise part 2, panelists. Thanks a million. And thank you to Jimmy for moderating.